The docking bay of Falgor Ring Station shook with the deep rumble of an incoming shuttle, and every species within 100 meters turned to watch the arrival board flash a single word none of them had ever seen before: human. Station Administrator Kelvos stood near the observation window with his 4 primary arms folded behind his back, and his 2 smaller arms tapping against a data tablet that held everything the Galactic Index had compiled on this new species from a distant blue world called Earth. He read the classification out loud to his assistant, a thin Verath female named Sanaya, and his voice carried the bored tone of someone who had processed 1,000 first contact arrivals. Persistence Predator, Class 2 Endurance Omnivore, Moderate Threat Index, no natural armor, no venom delivery system, no recorded faster-than-light aggression events, he said, and then he closed the file and slid the tablet under one of his arms. Teeth? Which was the Verath way of laughing, and she said, "So they are sending us something soft and slow, and we are supposed to be impressed." Helvos did not answer, because the shuttle bay doors had begun to open. The ship that came through was small and simple and gray, and it landed with a gentle hiss of pressure equalization that told everyone watching that the species inside breathed a nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, which was common enough to be boring. The ramp descended, and out walked a single figure. Dr. Marin Hale was not what anyone expected, though in truth nobody had expected much of anything. She was of average height for a human, lean and straight-backed, with dark hair pulled away from her face, and calm brown eyes that swept across the docking bay in a single slow pass before she smiled and stepped forward. She had no claws and no fangs, and no armor plating, and no quills, and no venom sacs, and nothing at all that the dozens of predator species, watching from the upper galleries, would consider a weapon. A group of Kraylith hunters stood near the cargo lane, each one standing nearly 3 meters tall, with thick scaled hides and retractable claws the length of a human forearm. And they watched Marin walk past with the lazy amusement of lions watching a rabbit cross an open field. One of them, a young male named Tarek, let out a low rumbling sound from his chest that was the Kraylith equivalent of a dismissive laugh, and he turned to his pack leader and said, "The new species sent a single female with no teeth and no escort, and she is smiling at us like she wants to be friends." His pack leader, a scarred veteran named Draven, said nothing, but flicked his tail once, which meant he agreed that this was not worth their attention. Marin walked through the bay and nodded to every species she passed, and her smile never wavered, and her pace never changed, and her hands stayed relaxed at her sides. Her at the processing gate, and extended one of his primary arms in the gesture of formal welcome. And Marin shook it without hesitation, which surprised him, because most new species flinched the first time they touched a Verath. His skin was cold and rough like stone. "Welcome to Falgor Ring Station, Dr. Hale," he said. "Thank you, Administrator," she said, and her voice was warm and steady and carried no tremor at all. "I am glad to be here, and I look forward to working with everyone on this station." He assigned her quarters on the middeck, which was neutral territory between the upper levels where the predator species lived and worked, and the lower market decks where the prey species ran their shops and trade stalls. She thanked him again and walked off with her single bag over one shoulder, and Kelvos watched her go and felt nothing remarkable about the encounter at all. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 hours later. Marin had gone down to the lower market to introduce herself to the merchants there, because her diplomatic brief said that the prey species handled most of the station's actual commerce, and that building relationships with them was essential to any trade agreement. She approached a stall run by a Delphari merchant, a small creature covered in soft silver fur, with long ears and wide dark eyes that sat in a face built for watchfulness. And she smiled and said hello and asked about the fabrics on display. The Delphari froze. Not in the way that someone freezes when they are surprised, but in the way that a creature freezes when every ancient signal in its body is telling it that death is standing right in front of it. And the only hope of survival is to not move, and not breathe, and not exist. Marin noticed and stepped back and softened her voice, and said she was sorry if she had startled them. The Delphari did not answer, because it could not speak. And then suddenly, it bolted, knocking over its own merchandise as it fled into the back corridors of the lower deck. Marin stood there, confused and a little hurt, and she looked around and realized that every prey species within sight was doing the same thing. The Mivosi herd grazers had clustered together, with their young pushed to the center. The Chelwi burrowers had retreated into their stall enclosures and sealed the doors, and a pair of Tomu traders had simply dropped their goods and run. The entire market had gone silent. Marin left quietly because she did not want to cause more fear, and she spent the rest of the evening in her quarters, reading cultural files and trying to figure out what she had done wrong. She found nothing. Meanwhile, 6 decks below, the Prey Species Liaison Council was holding an emergency session. 17 different prey species had filed formal instinctive threat responses within the same 3-hour window, and every single one of them named the same: the human. A Delphari council member stood before the assembly with his fur puffed out in distress and his voice shaking. And he said what every prey species in the room already felt in their bones, but had not yet said out loud. "That creature is not a Class 2, he said, and the room was so quiet that the hum of the station's air recyclers sounded like thunder. "Our people have been hunted by every kind of predator this galaxy has produced for longer than most species have existed. And our instincts have never been wrong, and I am telling you now that the thing that walked into our market today is the single most dangerous organism on this station, and it is not even close." The room erupted into frightened chatter, and the council chair had to call for silence 3 times before order was restored. They drafted a formal warning and sent it to Kelvos. He read it at his desk, sighed, and deleted it. He told himself, and he poured another drink and moved on to the next item on his schedule. In her quarters on the middeck, Marin Hale sat on the edge of her bed and looked out the viewport at the stars, and wondered why the small silver-furred creature had been so afraid of her. She had only wanted to say hello. Word traveled through the lower decks of Thalgor Ring Station the way fear always travels, fast and quiet and impossible to stop. By the second day of Marin Hale's presence on the station, every prey species, from the deepest maintenance corridors to the outermost trading rings, knew about her. And the warnings passed between them, not in words, but in the old languages. The flattened ears, and the wide eyes, and the twitching noses, and the huddled bodies pressed together in groups that faced outward. The Delphari stopped opening their stalls until they had checked the corridor cameras to make sure the human was not nearby. The Mivosi herd grazers rerouted their entire daily grazing walk through the station's oxygen gardens to avoid the mid-deck where Marin's quarters were. The Chelwi burrowers sealed their tunnels with secondary barricades they had not used since the last Kralith territorial expansion 3 cycles ago. And the strangest part of it all was that not one of them could explain why. Marin had not threatened anyone, and had not raised her voice, and had not bared her teeth. Though several Delphari, who had seen her smile, said that the display of flat white teeth inside a forward-facing predator skull was one of the most disturbing things they had ever witnessed, even though they knew it was meant to be friendly. She had brought small gifts to the market stalls: fabric samples from Earth, packets of dried fruit, a tiny wooden carving of a horse that she left on the counter of the stall, whose owner had fled from her on the first day. She was trying so hard to be kind that it made the prey species feel worse, because their rational minds told them she was good and gentle, while every survival instinct they had screamed that she was the most efficient killer they had ever been in a room with. On the 5th day, Marin sat alone at a bench in the lower market corridor, and she was not smiling anymore, because the loneliness of being feared by the very people she wanted to befriend had begun to wear on her. And she stared at her hands and wondered if there was something fundamentally broken about the way she existed in this place. That was where Tosca found her. Tosca was a Delphari elder, old enough that his silver fur had turned white at the tips of his ears, and he walked with a slowness that came not from age, but from the deep calm of a creature who had spent 70 years learning to read the world around him. He sat down on the bench beside Marin, and she looked at him with surprise, because no prey species had come within 10 meters of her willingly since she arrived. "You are sad," Tosca said, and his voice was soft and careful in the way that all Delphari voices were. "I am," Marin said. "I do not understand what I am doing wrong, and I have read every cultural guide I can find, and I cannot figure out why everyone here is so afraid of me." Tosca was quiet for a moment, then said, "You are lonely." Long time, and Marin noticed that his paws were trembling slightly, even as he sat there, and she realized that being this close to her was costing him something enormous, and that he was doing it anyway. "You are not doing anything wrong," Tosca said. "That is what makes it so frightening." Marin shook her head and said, "I do not understand." Tosca turned his wide, dark eyes toward her, and in them she saw something she had never seen directed at her before. Not hatred, not disgust, but the pure, unfiltered recognition of what she was, from the perspective of something that had evolved to be eaten. "Dr. Hale," he said, "when you walked into the market on your first day, you entered through the south corridor, and your eyes moved to the upper left corner first, and then swept right, and then down, and then you checked behind you once before you stepped forward. And you did all of this in less than 2 seconds, and you were not aware that you did it. Nothing, because he was right, and she had not noticed. Every predator species on this station does something similar," Tosca continued. "The Kralith check for rival pack scents. The Verath scan for ambush points. The Sasari taste the air for chemical signatures. And all of them do it in ways that we prey species have learned to read over thousands of generations, because reading predators is how we survive." He paused, and his trembling got worse, but he kept speaking. "But you are different," he said. "You did not check for rivals or ambush points or chemical traces, Dr. Hale. You checked for exits, and you counted the number of living beings in the room, and you noted which ones were moving and which ones were still. And you did this not because you were afraid, but because your body does it the way my body breathes. And the reason every prey species on this station is terrified of you is because we have never seen anything do what you do." "Now, the Kralith are ambush predators," Tosca said. "They burst and kill, and if the burst fails, they retreat. And we know how to survive them because we know the burst is coming. And the Verath are patient trappers, and we know how to spot their traps. And the Sithari are venomous strikers, and we know to watch for the coil before the strike. And every predator in this galaxy has a pattern that prey species have learned to read and avoid." His voice dropped lower. "But you have no pattern, Dr. Hale. Or rather, your pattern is everything. You watch like a Verath, and you track like a Sithari, and you have the social coordination of a Kralith pack, and the patience of a deep ocean Quellar, and you do all of it at once, inside a single body that never stops adjusting to its environment. And my people have been hunted for 40,000 generations, and we know what hunts us, and every cell in my body is telling me that your species hunted everything on your world. Everything. And that nothing ever got away." The silence between them was heavy. Marin looked at her hands again, and then she looked at Tosca, and she did not deny it. On my world, she said quietly, that is exactly what we did. Tosca nodded, as if she had confirmed something he already knew, and his trembling had not stopped, but he remained seated beside her, because he had decided that being brave mattered more than being safe. Meanwhile, on the upper decks, Marin's existence was barely a footnote. Draven and his Kralith pack had scheduled a trade negotiation with the human delegation, which was just Marin sitting alone on one side of a long table, while 7 Kralith hunters sat on the other side. And they had come in hot, because the Kralith approach to negotiation was the same as their approach to hunting: overwhelm fast and take what you want. Draven slammed his fist on the table, hard enough to crack the surface, and he leaned forward and let a deep growl roll out of his chest, and he bared his teeth, which were long and curved and designed for tearing, and he said that the terms would be set by the Kralith, and that the human would accept them or leave the station. Marin looked at the cracked table, and then looked at Draven, and her heart rate did not change, and her breathing did not quicken, and her pupils did not dilate, and she waited until the growl faded, and then she smiled and said, I appreciate the energy, but I think we can find terms that work for everyone, and I have some ideas if you are willing to hear them. Draven sat back and felt something cold move through him that he did not recognize, because no species had ever simply ignored his dominance display before, and the wrongness of it sat in his chest like a stone. After the meeting, he told his pack that the human was weak and had no fight in her, and that they would get whatever they wanted from Earth. Tarek agreed, and the pack laughed, and they went back to the upper deck and forgot about Marin Hale. But down in the lower market, old Tosca sat in his stall and heard the Kralith laughing through the deck plating above, and he shook his white-tipped ears and whispered to the Delphari merchant beside him. The hunters think they are the most dangerous things on this station, he said. They have never met something that does not stop. The trouble had been building for a long time before Marin arrived, and every prey species on the lower decks knew it was only a matter of time before the Kralith gang that called themselves the Vorath Circle decided that intimidation was not enough, and that real violence was the next step. Vorath himself was the leader, a Kralith even larger than Draven, with a scar that ran from the ridge of his skull down to his jaw, and eyes that were the flat yellow of a creature that had stopped pretending to be civilized a long time ago. His gang had been extorting prey species merchants for months, taking cuts of their profits and smashing stalls that refused to pay. And station security had filed reports but done nothing, because the security force was made up mostly of predator species who did not consider what happened in the lower market to be their problem. On the 9th day of Marin's time on the station, the Vorath Circle walked into the lower market and went straight to a small fabric stall run by a young Delphari named Pilch. Pilch was barely an adult by Delphari standards, with soft gray fur and wide, nervous eyes, and a habit of folding and unfolding the edges of his fabrics when he was anxious, which was most of the time. And he had been late on his payment to the Circle, because he had spent his earnings on medicine for his younger sister, who was sick. Vorath did not ask for an explanation. He grabbed the stall frame with one massive clawed hand and tore it apart, and the fabrics went flying, and the display cases shattered. And then he grabbed Pilch by the arm and threw him into the corridor wall hard enough to crack the plating, and Pilch hit the ground and did not get up right away because something in his shoulder had broken. The market went silent the way it always did when the Circle came through, and a dozen prey species watched from behind their stalls, with their eyes down and their bodies small, to help, because helping meant being next. Marin arrived 4 minutes later. She had been on the mid-deck reviewing trade documents when she heard the commotion through the ventilation system, and she came down the service ladder at a pace that was not running but was faster than walking. And she stepped into the market and saw Pilch on the ground, bleeding from a cut above his eye, with his arm bent at a wrong angle. She knelt beside him, and her hands moved with the steady, practiced calm of someone who had done field medicine before. And she checked his breathing, and stabilized his arm, and pressed a clean cloth to the cut on his head. And her voice was soft and warm as she told him he was going to be fine. But while her voice was warm, her eyes were not. The prey species in the market noticed it immediately, the same way they noticed everything about predators. Because the thing behind Marin's eyes had changed from the gentle diplomatic warmth she usually carried to something older and harder and infinitely more patient. And every prey species in that corridor felt the temperature drop, even though the environmental controls had not changed. Marin asked Pilch 3 questions. How many were there? What did they look like? Which direction did they go? She did not ask if he was scared, or how he felt, or whether he wanted to talk about it. And the precision of her questions sent a ripple of quiet terror through the watching prey species, because they recognized what those questions meant. She was not gathering information for a report. She was acquiring a target. She helped Pilch to the medical bay and made sure he was treated, and then she went back to her quarters. And for the next 48 hours, she did something that no predator species on Thalgor Ring Station had ever seen done before. She hunted. Not the way the Kralith hunted, with bursts of speed and displays of force, and the raw, overwhelming power of a pack charging down its prey. Not the way the Veroth hunted, with traps and patience and a single perfect strike from ambush. Not the way the Sithari hunted, with venom and silence, and the cold mathematical certainty of a chemical kill. Marin hunted the way humans hunt. She watched. She learned the Voroth Circle's patrol routes by sitting in different corridors at different times, and reading a book on her data tablet, while her peripheral vision mapped every Kralith who passed, and the time they passed, and the direction they came from and went to. She learned their sleep cycles by checking the station's power usage logs for their quarters, which were public record because Thalgor Station had transparency laws that nobody ever used, because nobody had ever thought to weaponize bureaucracy before. She learned their supply chains by tracking which docking bays their cargo came through and which merchants on the upper deck supplied them, and she did this by having polite conversations with dock workers, who were happy to talk to the friendly human who brought them coffee. She identified every member of the circle, and she mapped their relationships, and she found the cracks, the rivalries, the debts, the grudges, the members who were loyal and the members who were afraid, and she stored all of it in her head because she did not write anything down. Then she began to dismantle them. She went to the Prey Species Liaison Council and helped them file a formal economic disruption complaint that triggered an automatic review of the Circle's docking privileges. And the review froze their access to 3 of their 4 cargo bays. She went to the station's trade commission and submitted 17 individual grievances from prey species merchants, each one documented with dates and damages and witness statements that Marin had gathered over 2 days of quiet conversations in the lower market. Identified a rival Kralith faction on the station, a trading group that had been pushed out of a profitable corridor by the Circle 6 months ago, and she arranged a meeting between them and the prey species merchants, and brokered a new trade route that cut the Circle out of their primary revenue stream entirely. She contacted the station's communications office and requested public disclosure of the Circle's registered business activities, which revealed that Vorath had been filing false cargo manifests, which was a serious offense under station law. She did all of this while attending diplomatic functions and smiling and shaking hands and sleeping 6 hours a night, and never once raising her voice or her fist. The Circle began to fall apart from the inside because their money was gone and their cargo access was frozen, and their rivals were moving into their territory, and their own members were turning on each other as the pressure mounted. Understood what was happening, because none of them had ever been hunted before. On the 12th day, Vorath figured out who was responsible. He found Marin in a corridor on the middeck, and he stepped in front of her and blocked her path, and he was enormous, nearly 3 meters of scaled muscle and rage, with his claws fully extended, and his teeth bared, and his chest rumbling, with the deep subsonic growl that Kralith used to paralyze prey before a kill. Marin stopped walking and looked up at him. She did not step back, and she did not flinch, and she did not reach for a weapon, because she did not have one, and her heart rate held steady at 62 beats per minute, which would have horrified any medical scanner calibrated for a prey species. "You are the one," Vorath growled, and his voice was like rocks grinding together. "You are the one who has been destroying my operation." "Yes," Marin said, and she said it the way someone confirms the truth. Vorath leaned down until his face was centimeters from hers, and his breath was hot and smelled of copper, and his claws twitched at his sides. "I could kill you right now," he said. "You could," Marin said, and then she took one step forward, which made Vorath blink, because nothing had ever moved toward him when he was in a killing posture. "But your species are ambush predators, Vorath. You rely on one burst of overwhelming force, and if the target does not fall in that first burst, you do not know what to do next, and that is your biology, and you cannot change it." She held his gaze, and her brown eyes did not waver. "My species is different," she said. "We are the ones who kept going, and on my world we did not chase prey because we were faster. We chased them because we did not stop, not after an hour, and not after a day, and not after a week. And the prey ran, and eventually their legs failed, and their hearts gave out, while they lay gasping, and finished what we started." She let that sit in the air between them. "You can kill me right now," she said again, "but there are 8 billion more of me, and we remember everything, and we do not forgive, and we do not forget, and we do not stop. And if you kill me, the next human who comes to this station will know your name, and your face, and your entire operation. And the one after that will too, and the one after that, and you will never have another peaceful day as long as you live." Something moved behind Vorath's flat yellow eyes, something ancient and instinctive that his conscious mind did not have a name for, but his body recognized with the deep cellular certainty of an animal that has just encountered a predator it was not designed to survive. He stepped back. He did not know why. Marin walked past him and continued down the corridor at the same steady pace she always used, and she did not look back, because she did not need to. The Vorath circle dissolved within a week, and Marin Hale had never raised a hand. The story of what Marin Hale did to the Vorath circle moved through Thalgor Ring Station like a slow wave, and unlike the fast, frightened whispers that had passed between the prey species in the early days, this wave moved upward, through the predator decks where it landed with a weight that none of them had expected. The Kralith talked about it first, because the circle had been one of theirs, and losing an entire operation without a single drop of blood being spilled was something that simply did not happen in their experience of the galaxy. Draven sat in his quarters with his pack, and turned the events over in his mind again and again, and the thing that troubled him most was not that Marin had won, it was that he could not identify the moment when the fight had started. Every predator species understood the shape of conflict. There was posturing, and then escalation, and then the strike, and then the aftermath. But Marin had skipped all of it, and simply began taking the circle apart piece by piece, from the inside, while smiling and attending diplomatic dinners. And by the time Vorath realized he was being hunted, the hunt was already over. Tarek, the young Kralith, who had laughed when Marin first arrived, was no longer laughing, and when Draven asked him what he thought, Tarek said, "She did to Vorath what water does to stone. She did not hit him. She just never stopped pressing, and eventually he was not there anymore." Draven did not respond to that, because the image it put in his head made his scales itch in a way he did not like. On the Verath administrative deck, Quel'Vos sat at his desk and did something he should have done on the first day. He opened the full ecological file on Earth and began to read. He read for 6 hours. By the end of the first hour, his secondary arms had stopped moving, which was a sign of deep focus in a Verath. By the end of the third hour, his primary arms were gripping the edge of his desk, hard enough to leave marks in the metal. By the end of the 6th hour, he pushed back from his desk and sat in silence for a long time. And his assistant Sanaya found him like that and asked if something was wrong. The prey species were right, Kelvos said, and his voice was very quiet. They were right about everything. He turned his screen toward her, and Sanaya read what was on it. Humans had evolved on a planet where nearly everything was trying to kill them. The weather, the terrain, the plants, the animals, the diseases, and each other. And instead of specializing the way every other predator species in the galaxy had done, they had generalized, becoming the single most adaptable organism their world had ever produced. They hunted in packs, but could hunt alone. They used tools, but could kill without them. They ate meat, but could survive on plants. They were not the fastest, or the strongest, or the toughest, but they were the only species on their planet that could chase prey until the prey's body simply gave out from exhaustion, running for hours and days across open ground in heat that would kill most other predators. And then the file got worse. Humans had driven their planet's megafauna to extinction on 4 separate continents. Massive creatures with thick hides and horns and tusks that should have been untouchable had simply ceased to exist because humans decided they were food. They had hunted their planet's other apex predators, wolves, great cats, bears, crocodilian reptiles, to the edge of oblivion, and then, in a twist that Kelvos found more disturbing than anything else in the file, they had stopped and decided to protect them. Not because they were afraid of them, but because they felt guilty about how easy it had been to destroy them. They had taken wolves, pack-hunting apex predators with jaws that could crush bone, and turned them into companions that slept in their homes, and obeyed their commands. They had conquered every environment on their planet, from frozen ice fields to boiling deserts to the bottom of their oceans. And they had done it not over millions of years, but in tens of thousands, which was barely a blink in evolutionary terms. Sanaya finished reading and her teeth were not clicking anymore. What classification did the index give them, she asked. Class 2, Kelvos said. That is wrong, Sanaya said. Yes, Kelvos said, and he opened the diplomatic registry and changed the entry himself. The new classification read, Apex Persistence Predator, Class No, No Known Upper Limit. He flagged it with a note that said, Recommend reclassification of all future human contacts to maximum diplomatic priority, and do not under any circumstances attempt dominance-based negotiation tactics. Then he poured himself a drink, and his hands were not steady. The change on the station was visible within days. Kralith hunters who had previously walked through the mid-deck corridors without even noticing Marin began stepping to the side when she approached, pressing their scaled backs against the wall to give her room. And they did this not because anyone told them to, but because the story of the Vorath Circle had triggered something instinctive in them. The recognition that this soft, small creature with no claws and no fangs had taken apart a Kralith operation using nothing but patience and memory and the willingness to keep going. The Verath stopped making eye contact with her, which in their culture was the highest sign of deference, reserved only for individuals they considered to be above them in the hierarchy of threat. A delegation of Sithari, the snake-like venomous ambush predators who had some of the most lucrative trade contracts on the station, sent a formal request to renegotiate their deal with the human delegation, and the request was polite and respectful in a way that Sithari communications had never been with any species before. Marin was confused by all of it. She had not changed anything about herself. She still walked the same corridors at the same pace and smiled at the same people and drank the same bitter station coffee every morning, and yet The entire social landscape of the station had shifted around her, as though she had done something extraordinary, when all she had done was solve a problem the same way humans had always solved problems, by paying attention and not giving up. But the most important change was the one that happened in the lower market. Tosca came to Marin's quarters one evening and invited her to tea in his stall, and when she arrived she found that there were other prey species there too, a Mivosi elder, 2 Chelwi traders, and a young Delphari woman who kept her distance but did not run. They were all still afraid of her, and Marin could see it in the way they held their bodies and the way their eyes tracked her every movement. But they were there, and that mattered more than the fear. Tosca poured the tea and said, "We have a proposal." Marin listened. The prey species wanted to access the upper deck markets, which had been closed to them by unwritten predator species territorial agreements for as long as the station had existed. And they wanted Marin to broker the deal, because no predator on the station would refuse her. Marin spent the next 2 weeks negotiating, and she was relentless in the way that only a human could be. She attended 14 meetings and filed 23 trade petitions and had 40 individual conversations with predator species trade leaders, and she did not raise her voice once, and she did not threaten anyone, and she did not stop until the agreement was signed. The upper deck markets opened to prey species for the first time in the station's history. Marin helped Pilch, the young Delphari merchant whose stall had been destroyed by the Vorat Circle, set up a new stall on the upper deck, and when he hung his banner, she saw that he had added a small earth flag beside it. "Why the flag?" she asked. Pilch looked up at her with his wide Delphari eyes, and he was still a little afraid, but he was also something else, something that looked like the beginning of trust. "It keeps the predators polite," he said. Marin laughed, and the sound carried through the upper market, and several Kralith nearby shifted uncomfortably, because they did not know what was funny, but they knew the human was involved, and that was enough to make them nervous. That evening she sat with Tosca in the lower market, and they drank tea together in comfortable silence. And finally Tosca said, "You are still terrifying, Dr. Hale." "I know," Marin said. "I am sorry." Tosca shook his old white-tipped ears, and looked at her with something that was not fear anymore, or at least, not just fear. "Least not only fear. Do not be sorry," he said. "For the first time in my life, the most terrifying thing on the station is on our side, and I am old enough to know how rare that is." Marin held her tea and did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and the two of them sat together while the station hummed around them, and for the first time since she arrived, she did not feel alone. 6 months after Marin Hale walked off a gray shuttle, with a single bag and a smile, Thalgor Ring Station had become something it had never been before, and something that the species who built it had never imagined it could be. It was not a predator station anymore. It was not a prey station either. It was something new. A place where a Kralith hunter could stand in line at a tea shop behind a Delphari merchant, and neither of them would think twice about it. Where a Sithari trade delegate could sit across a table from a Mivosi elder and negotiate in good faith, because both of them knew that the quiet human woman 3 decks up would find out if they did not. The hierarchy had not been destroyed. It had been reorganized around a new center of gravity, and that center was a species that most of the galaxy had never heard of 6 months ago. The Galactic Council took notice. They sent an evaluator, a tall insectoid named Commissioner Vreth. Thandorian Assessment Bureau, a species known for their cold analytical precision and their complete lack of emotional bias, which made them ideal for situations where objectivity mattered. Vreth arrived on the station with a team of 3 assistants and a mandate to evaluate the impact of Earth's first diplomatic presence on a multi-species habitat. And she spent 2 weeks conducting interviews and reviewing records and observing interactions. And what she found made her reassess several fundamental assumptions about the galaxy's predator-prey classification system. She interviewed the predator species first. Draven sat across from her in the interview room, and he was not the same Kraelith who had cracked a table to intimidate a human 6 months ago. He was quieter now, more careful with his words, and when Vreth asked him to describe the human presence on the station, he was silent for a long time before he spoke. "We are the Blade," Draven said, low and thoughtful, in a way that Kraelith voices rarely were. "We are fast and we are deadly, and we are proud of what we are. But the human showed us something we did not know we were missing. She showed us that being the blade is not enough, because a blade does not decide when to fall, and the human is the hand that decides. And we never learned to be the hand." Vreth made a note and asked what he meant. "I mean that we know how to kill," Draven said, "but the human knows how to choose, and choosing is harder than killing, and I did not understand that until I watched her take apart the Vorath circle without drawing blood, and I have been thinking about it every day since." Vreth interviewed Kelvos next. The Vareth administrator sat behind his desk, and he looked tired in the way that someone looks when their understanding of the world has been fundamentally rearranged, and they have not yet finished putting the new pieces together. "Was about the kill," Quelvas said. "Every predator species in the Galactic Index is classified by how they kill. The speed of the strike, the lethality of the venom, the power of the jaw, the sharpness of the claw. And we built our entire social hierarchy around that assumption. And then the human arrived and showed us that we were measuring the wrong thing." "What should you have been measuring?" Vreth asked. "The hunt," Quelvas said. "Not the kill, the hunt. The willingness to begin something and see it through to the end, no matter how long it takes. The patience to watch and learn before acting. The ability to adapt to any environment and any situation and any opponent. And by that measure, the human is not just another predator on this station. She is something else entirely, and it terrifies me in a way that I find deeply respectful." Vreth made another note. She interviewed the Sithari delegation leader, who coiled tightly in her chair, and said, "We are ambush predators, and we have always believed that the perfect strike wins every conflict. But the human does not give you a moment to strike. She is always moving, always adjusting, always 3 steps ahead. And by the time you realize you are in a conflict with her, the conflict is already over, and she has won. And the worst part is that she will smile at you afterward and offer you coffee, as though nothing happened." Vreth moved to the prey species. Tosca sat in the interview room with his paws folded in his lap and his white-tipped ears relaxed. And when Vreth asked him about the human, he smiled, which was something Delphari did not do easily. "I was the first prey species on this station to sit beside her," Tosca said, "and I did it because someone had to, and because I am old enough to be more curious than afraid. And what I learned is that the prey species were right about her from the beginning. She is the most dangerous thing on this station, and it is not close." "We're wrong about what that meant?" Vreth asked. "It means that for the first time in the history of this station, the most dangerous creature here chose to protect the weakest instead of exploit them," Tosca said, "and that is not something my people have ever experienced before. And it has changed us. And I think it has changed the predators too. And I think that is what humans do. They change things, not by force, but by being so relentlessly themselves that everything around them has to adjust." Vreth interviewed Pilch, who sat in his chair with his repaired arm and his wide eyes, and talked about his new stall on the upper deck and the Earth flag that hung beside his banner. "The predators leave me alone now," Pilch said, "not because they are afraid of me, but because they know that the human helped me, and that if they bother me, she will know about it. And I used to think that I would spend my whole life being small and afraid, and trying not to be noticed, but she noticed me, and she helped me, and she did not ask for anything in return." The last interview was with a Delphari child named Kessa, who was 7 years old and the daughter of one of the lower market merchants. And Vreth almost did not include her in the evaluation, but her assistant suggested it, and Vreth agreed. Kessa climbed into the interview chair, and her feet did not touch the ground. And her silver fur was fluffy and unkempt in the way that children's fur always was. And Vreth asked her what she thought about the human. Kessa thought about it for a moment, and then she said, "The human lady is scary." Vreth nodded and waited. "But she gave me a candy, and she said I was brave," Kessa continued. "And she picks me up when I ask, and she smells like the warm drink she is always holding. And my mother says she is the reason the big ones do not come to the market and break things anymore. And I want to be brave like her when I grow up." Vreth closed her notes and sat quietly for a moment, and then she thanked Kessa and ended the interview. That evening in her quarters, Marin received a copy of the Galactic Council's preliminary classification report for humanity, which had been forwarded to her by Kelvos with a short note that said simply, "You should see this." She opened it on her data tablet and scrolled through the ecological profiles of Earth's species. Wolves, listed as cooperative pack hunters; crocodilians, listed as aquatic ambush predators; eagles, listed as aerial pursuit raptors; great white sharks, listed as oceanic apex predators. And each one had a threat classification and an ecological role description and a behavioral profile. She scrolled until she reached the entry for Homo sapiens, and she read it. Pursuit predator. Endurance-based locomotion adapted for persistence hunting across varied terrain and climate zones. Advanced tool use, spanning simple implements to planetary scale engineering. Omnivorous dietary flexibility allowing survival in any biome. Social apex predator with cooperative group structures ranging from pair bonds to civilizational scale organization. No environment unconquered, no biome uninhabited, no competing species unchallenged. Unique among all index species for developing conservation ethics after achieving total ecological dominance. Classification: Apex of Apex, threat level, contingent on intent. Marin read the last line again, contingent on intent, and she sat with that for a while, because it was the truest thing anyone had ever said about our species. Humans were not dangerous because of what they could do. They were dangerous because of what they chose to do. She closed the file and set the tablet down, and looked out the viewport at the stars, and she thought about home, about the long grasslands where her ancestors had first stood upright and looked at the horizon and decided to walk toward it, about the cave paintings that proved they had always wanted to leave a mark, about the ships and the roads and the bridges and the cities and the wars and the songs, and the long, long walk that had taken them from a single valley in Africa to every corner of their world, and now finally into the dark between the stars. She put on her jacket and walked out of her quarters and into the station's main promenade. The corridor was busy with the evening traffic of 100 species going about their lives, and as Marin walked through it, the station rearranged itself around her the way it always did now. A pair of Kralith hunters saw her coming and stepped to the side, pressing against the wall, and they dipped their massive heads in a gesture that was not quite a bow, but was close. A Varath trade official turned away as she passed, breaking eye contact in the deep reflexive deference that his species reserved for something above them in the chain. Sithari coiled tighter in her alcove and went very still, the way her kind always did when a superior predator moved through their space. And in the lower market, a small silver-furred Delphari child named Kessa saw Marin coming and did something that no prey species on the station had done before. She ran toward her. Not away, not sideways, not into a hiding place. She ran straight toward the most dangerous creature on the station with her arms open and her fur bouncing and a laugh bubbling out of her that was pure and bright and completely unafraid. Marin scooped her up and settled her on one hip, and Kessa wrapped her small paws around Marin's neck and said, "You smell like the warm drink again." "I always smell like the warm drink," Marin said, and she kept walking through the promenade with a Delphari child on her hip and a smile on her face. Every predator on the station watched her go. The Kralith, with their claws and their killing bursts, watched her go. The Verath, with their traps and their ambush patience, watched her go. The Sithari, with their venom and their cold precision, watched her go. Not one of them followed. They knew better. And in a small stall on the upper deck, old Tosca poured himself a cup of tea and listened to the sound of a child laughing somewhere in the promenade. And he smiled his rare Delphari smile, and said to no one in particular, "Apex of Apex." Then he drank his tea, and the station hummed, and the stars turned outside the viewports. And somewhere in the corridor a human woman carried a child who was not afraid, and that, Tosca thought, was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen in 70 years of being alive, because the prey species had been right from the very beginning.